You can't withdraw that amount, not without further proof. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an accusation. Whispers stirred among the customers waiting in line. A few leaned in, curious, as though they were watching a thief caught red-handed. The woman's jaw tightened. She knew this wasn't about paperwork. It was about something deeper, an insult disguised as policy. The teller glanced nervously at the manager. Instead of authorizing the withdrawal, he nodded toward the security guard standing near the door. Heavy footsteps approached, echoing on the polished floor, each one announcing that she wasn't welcome here. Her request wasn't complicated. It was her money, yet here she was, being treated as though she had no right to it. The guard folded his arms across his chest, waiting for an order. Customers exchanged glances, some smirked, others shifted uneasily. And through it all, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She only stood straighter, her silence heavier than the accusation hanging in the air. What none of them realized was that those next 8 minutes would change everything. Not just for her, but for the people staring at her like she didn't belong. Because she wasn't just a customer. She wasn't just another account number. By the time those minutes were over, the entire branch would be turned upside down, and jobs would be gone. Before we continue, if stories like this move you, make sure to subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ so you don't miss the next one. And let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. I love seeing where our family of viewers is tuning in. Long before that confrontation at the counter, she had built a name that carried weight in boardrooms and on balance sheets. Zendaya Gray wasn't born into wealth or connections. She was born into a small 2-bedroom home where every dollar mattered. Her mother worked long shifts as a nurse, her father repaired cars at a modest garage, and Zendaya learned early that nothing would be handed to her. She excelled at numbers. By the time her classmates were stumbling through fractions, Zendaya was already tutoring them for pocket change. College wasn't easy. Scholarships and late-night jobs kept her afloat. But she pushed through, graduating at the top of her class in finance. That degree wasn't just paper to her. It was proof that the girl people once doubted could rise above every whispered, "You don't belong here." She entered the world of banking not as a client, but as an employee. And it was there she encountered her first real taste of corporate racism. Passed over for promotions, questioned on her reports, introduced in meetings as the assistant when she was the one leading the project. Each slight left its mark, but none stopped her. Zendaya built a reputation for being unshakable. She didn't argue to prove herself. Her results spoke louder. Years later, Zendaya founded her own fintech company. What started as a small team working from laptops in a rented office grew into a multi-million-dollar firm. She didn't flaunt her success. She still drove herself to work, still carried the same leather briefcase she bought fresh out of college. Power wasn't about flashing wealth, it was about using it to lift others. Her company became known for hiring overlooked talent, graduates who couldn't get callbacks because of their names, professionals ignored because of their accents or skin color. Zendaya gave them not just jobs, but dignity. And that loyalty showed in how fiercely her employees worked for her. On the morning she walked into that bank, she wasn't withdrawing money for herself. She was carrying the weight of hundreds of paychecks, rent, childcare, bills. Her employees depended on her. She knew what it meant to wait for money that never arrived, and she would never let her people suffer that. This wasn't about luxury. It was about responsibility, about keeping promises to those who believed in her. That's why, standing at the counter, hearing the manager's doubt dressed up as policy, her anger wasn't just personal. It was multiplied by every employee depending on her. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and carried too many on her shoulders to let a single act of prejudice strip her of respect. And yet, as heavy as that moment was, she didn't flinch. She had faced worse. What that manager didn't know was that Zendaya Gray wasn't a woman easily denied, especially not in her own bank. The glass doors swung open with a soft push, and Zendaya stepped into the branch she had been visiting for years. Nothing about her demeanor suggested doubt. She walked with the same calm confidence that had carried her into boardrooms across the country. To her, this visit was routine. Make a large withdrawal, move on with her day, and ensure her employees got their salaries on time. The teller greeted her politely at first. Zendaya slid the withdrawal slip across the counter along with her ID and bank card. But the moment the teller's eyes landed on the amount, the atmosphere shifted. The woman behind the glass blinked, glanced up at Zendaya, then back at the slip, her smile faltering. One moment, please." The pause wasn't about procedure, it was hesitation laced with suspicion. Instead of processing the request, the teller excused herself and disappeared into the manager's office. When the manager emerged, his expression carried the kind of authority that didn't need words. He walked straight to Zendaya, ignoring the slip of paper in his hand, his eyes scanning her as though searching for flaws. "This is a large amount," he said flatly, his tone clipped and condescending. "Can you provide proof this account is actually yours?" Zendaya didn't move. Her documents were already on the counter, her signature clear, her identification beyond question. Yet here she was, asked to prove herself all over again. Behind her, a line of customers began to murmur. Heads tilted, whispers spreading like wildfire. To them, it looked like an ordinary day disrupted by a fraud case. Their glances weren't neutral. They were loaded with assumptions, their stares pressing down on Zendaya like a silent verdict. She spoke evenly. "The account is mine. Everything you need is right in front of you." The manager smirked, as though humoring a child. "That's not enough. We'll need to freeze this account until we verify the source of funds." Frankly, these numbers raise questions. He leaned closer, lowering his voice but not enough to hide the disdain. "People try to pull stunts like this all the time." The word "people" hung heavy in the air, sharpened by the way he said it. Zendaya's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the recognition of something she had lived with all her life. She knew exactly what kind of people he meant. The whispers behind her grew louder. A man in line muttered something about scams. Another chuckled under his breath. The manager straightened and gestured toward the guard near the entrance. "Please stand by. We may need to escort her out." The guard began his slow approach, his footsteps deliberate, his expression blank. The branch had become a stage, with Zendaya cast as the criminal, and everyone else an eager audience. Yet through it all, Zendaya didn't waver. She didn't raise her voice, didn't plead, didn't flinch. Her stillness spoke louder than any argument. She had dealt with men like this before, men who mistook dignity for weakness, silence for surrender. She slid her hands calmly over the counter, gathering her ID back into her grasp. Her eyes locked on the manager's, steady and unblinking. Every tick of the clock deepened the tension. Customers leaned in, waiting for a scene. The guard closed the distance, standing just feet away now. "Before we continue, let me pause for a moment. If stories like this move you, stories of dignity, injustice, and resilience, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. And let me know in the comments the country you're watching from. I'd love to see where our community is growing around the world." But Zendaya only adjusted her stance, straightening her shoulders, as if preparing for something greater than their judgment. The manager mistook her quiet for defeat. He didn't realize that silence can hold more weight than anger, that silence can be the pause before thunder. What he didn't know was that Zendaya Gray's silence was never a weakness. It was calculation. The room held its breath, waiting for Zendaya to crack. Customers stared. The guard loomed closer, and the manager folded his arms as though victory was already his. But Zendaya only reached into her handbag, not with panic, not with haste, but with a steadiness that unsettled the air around her. Out came her phone. She tapped once, twice, and pressed it to her ear. The line rang for less than a second before a voice answered, authoritative, crisp, the kind that turned meetings into silence. "Zendaya, what's going on?" Every syllable carried familiarity, respect, weight. Zendaya spoke calmly, never breaking eye contact with the manager. "I'm at your downtown branch. I've been denied a withdrawal. My account has been threatened with a freeze." On the other end, the pause was sharp, then laced with disbelief. "Denied? At your bank?" The voice grew louder, enough for those nearby to catch. "Put the manager on." The color drained from the man's face. He fumbled, unsure if this was real. Zendaya extended the phone across the counter, her hands steady, her gaze unyielding. The manager hesitated before taking it, pressing it to his ear with a hand that trembled more than he wanted to admit. Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? The voice thundered through the speaker, filling the entire branch. Authorize the withdrawal immediately. And let me remind you, Zendaya Gray isn't just a client. She's a majority shareholder. She owns this bank. A ripple moved through the lobby. The whispers shifted from suspicion to shock. The guard froze mid-step, uncertainty breaking his mask of authority. The teller who had first hesitated lowered her eyes, her hands shaking at the keyboard. Zendaya retrieved her phone, her expression unchanged, and slipped it back into her bag. She hadn't raised her voice once, yet the weight of her presence now commanded the entire branch. The manager stuttered, his earlier arrogance unraveling into apologies. "Miss Gray, I didn't realize." Zendaya cut him off with silence, a silence far heavier than words. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the room. "You saw my documents. You had everything you needed. Yet you chose to treat me like a criminal. Why?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came. There was no policy to shield him. No excuse that could mask what everyone had witnessed. The teller hurriedly processed the withdrawal, sliding the slip back with trembling fingers. Zendaya accepted it without glancing down. Her eyes never left the manager's, locking him in a gaze that made the power shift undeniable. For the customers who had smirked earlier, the realization sank in. The woman they had judged, the one they thought powerless, now stood taller than everyone in that room. 8 minutes. That was all it had taken for the narrative to flip. 8 minutes to expose not just one man's bias, but the fragility of an entire system built on it. And though Zendaya had gotten what she came for, her presence made it clear. This confrontation wasn't over. The withdrawal was only the beginning. The withdrawal slip sat on the counter, stamped and approved at last. But Zendaya didn't reach for it. She let the silence stretch instead, her presence pulling every eye toward her. The room that once saw her as a suspect now waited for her next move. She picked up the slip slowly, folded it with precision, and tucked it away. Then she turned to the teller, her voice steady. "Thank you. You may step aside now." The teller exhaled in relief and hurried back to her desk, her head lowered. Zendaya shifted her gaze back to the manager. His face had gone from smug certainty to pale discomfort, but his stance remained defensive, arms crossed as if clinging to a position already lost. "Gather your staff," Zendaya said, her tone carrying the weight of an order. "Now." The command left no room for argument. The manager stammered, but obeyed, gesturing for the employees scattered across the lobby to come forward. The guard, unsure of his role anymore, lingered by the door, avoiding Zendaya's eyes. Within moments, half a dozen employees stood before her. Tellers, assistants, clerks, all of them quiet, waiting. Zendaya spoke clearly, ensuring every customer in the room could hear. "What happened here today was not a misunderstanding, it was discrimination. I walked in with identification, with documentation, with proof, and I was denied not because of procedure, but because of perception." The words cut through the air, heavy with truth. A few customers lowered their heads, shame creeping into their faces as they realized they had played along with the manager's assumptions. Zendaya turned her eyes on the man in charge. "You accused me of fraud. You threatened to freeze my account. You called security, not because there was a risk, but because of who I am." The manager swallowed hard. "Miss Gray, She raised a hand. "No excuses. I've heard them all before. Today you showed every person in this lobby that prejudice guides your judgment, and that makes you unfit to lead." The murmur in the crowd swelled. Some nodded, others whispered agreement. The balance of the room had shifted. Zendaya straightened her shoulders. "Effective immediately, you are dismissed from this branch." Gasps rippled through the space. The manager's mouth opened in protest, but before he could speak, Zendaya continued, her voice cutting clean through the noise. "And to those who stood by and allowed this, those who nodded, those who smirked while I was treated like a criminal, your silence made you complicit." Her gaze swept across two tellers in particular, both of whom had exchanged amused glances when security was called. "You too will no longer serve at this bank." The two employees shifted uneasily, their faces draining of color. Zendaya wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Her authority was carved into every syllable, undeniable and final. The guard lowered his head, guilt flashing briefly across his face. Zendaya turned to him last. "And you You were ready to escort me out without a question. Remember this the next time you are told to remove someone. Ask yourself whether it is about safety or bias." He nodded silently, the weight of the lesson pressing on him harder than any reprimand. The crowd had grown hushed again, but it wasn't the silence of suspicion this time. It was the silence of reckoning. Every customer in that lobby now understood the power dynamic had flipped entirely. Zendaya leaned forward just slightly, her voice soft yet commanding. "Let this be clear. This bank is not a place where dignity is negotiable. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of color, background, or balance." She let her words linger, deliberately, forcing them to sink into the minds of everyone present. Then, for the first time, she smiled, but it wasn't warmth. It was the kind of smile that comes from justice delivered. The manager stood frozen, his career collapsing in the very building he thought he controlled. The dismissed employees hung their heads, realizing their arrogance had cost them everything. And Zendaya? She simply adjusted her jacket, turned slightly toward the lobby of watching eyes, and delivered one final line before walking out. "This is what happens when you mistake prejudice for power." By the time Zendaya stepped out of the branch, the story was already beginning to spread. A young man in line had recorded the entire confrontation on his phone, uploading it to social media before she even reached her car. Within minutes, the clip was being shared across platforms, comments flooding in faster than the view count could keep up. The headline wrote itself: "Black woman denied withdrawal, revealed as bank owner, fires racist manager on the spot." The video captured every moment, the doubt in the manager's tone, the security guard's heavy steps, the stunned silence when Zendaya's authority was revealed. And the internet had no shortage of opinions. Unbelievable. This is what happens every day to people without her kind of power. She handled it with more grace than I ever could. That manager thought he was humiliating her. Instead, he humiliated himself. By the end of the day, news stations picked up the story. Reporters parked outside the branch, interviewing customers who had been there. Some admitted their own discomfort. One woman confessed on camera, "I thought she was in the wrong at first. I didn't question it. Now I realize I judged her without cause, and that makes me part of the problem." The bank's corporate office scrambled to respond. A polished statement was released, filled with phrases about unfortunate misunderstandings and commitment to diversity. But the public wasn't fooled. The video told the real story, unfiltered. Meanwhile, the dismissed employees faced their own reckoning. Their names were whispered across the city, their reputations reduced to hashtags. For years, they had moved through life unchecked, treating certain customers with suspicion. Now, those quiet acts of bias were illuminated for the world to see. Zendaya herself did not rush to speak publicly. She didn't need to. Her actions in the branch were louder than any press release. But as the story grew, she received messages from strangers across the country. Letters, emails, direct messages, from people who had faced the same kind of discrimination, but never had the chance to fight back. One message read, "I was denied a car loan despite perfect credit. They said it was about paperwork, but I knew better. Watching you stand there and not back down, it gave me the courage to try again." Another came from a young girl. "My mom works at a bank. She tells me people assume she's the janitor. When I saw what you did, I told her, one day, I'll be the one in charge too." The branch itself became a symbol. Customers who once lined up casually now entered with hesitation, aware that its name was tied to a scandal. Some left entirely, moving their accounts elsewhere. Others stayed, but only to see what Zendaya would do next. For Zendaya, the most telling response wasn't online. It was in her community. People stopped her on the street, thanking her for exposing what so many had endured silently. Small business owners, church leaders, even high school students told her the same thing. "You spoke for us." What happened in that branch was more than one woman being denied her money. It was a mirror held up to a system that thrived on quiet humiliation, on policies weaponized against people of color. And now, the mirror had cracks. Zendaya knew the story had gone viral, not just because of the drama, but because it touched something raw and real. The truth that success and wealth could not shield a black woman from bias. That was what made people furious, and that was what made them rally. As the evening news replayed the video, an anchor summed it up in one line: this wasn't just a withdrawal denied, it was dignity denied. And in the end, dignity won. But for Zendaya, it wasn't victory yet. Viral outrage faded quickly. What mattered was whether this moment would spark something lasting. And she intended to make sure it did. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment. If stories like this move you, stories of dignity, injustice, and resilience, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. And let me know in the comments the country you're watching from. I'd love to see where our community is growing around the world. As the media frenzy swirled, Zendaya stayed quiet for a few days, watching how the conversation unfolded. She wasn't surprised by the polarized reactions. Some applauded her strength, others downplayed the incident as a miscommunication. But what struck her most was how many people shared their own stories. Stories that sounded all too familiar. This wasn't about one branch, it was about an entire system that had operated unchecked for decades. Zendaya had known that truth long before the cameras caught her standing at that counter. She had lived it. She remembered her first attempt to buy a home. Fresh out of college, armed with steady employment and a solid credit score, she walked into a bank, eager to take the next step in her life. Instead of approval, she got questions. Did she really have the income she claimed? Could she prove the deposits were legitimate? The loan was denied. Months later, a white colleague with less income and worse credit was approved with ease. Years later, when she applied for funding to launch her fintech company, the same walls rose again. A panel of lenders smiled politely, nodded at her business plan, then told her to come back with a partner. The unspoken part was clear: come back with someone who didn't look like her. Zendaya fought through it, but she never forgot those barriers. And she knew she wasn't alone. Reports showed Black applicants were more likely to be denied loans, more likely to be charged higher interest rates, and more likely to be treated as risks, even when their financial profiles matched or exceeded their white counterparts. Entire communities were labeled high risk, cutting families off from opportunities to build wealth. For Zendaya, standing in that branch wasn't just about retrieving money. It was about facing the same old prejudice dressed in new clothes. Her account had millions behind it, yet to the manager, she was still suspicious. Her success didn't erase the bias, it only made it more blatant. She thought of the people who didn't have her platform, her influence, her ownership stake in the bank itself. What happened when they walked in with a request? Who spoke up for them when the teller hesitated, when the manager leaned in with that same tone of doubt? The more she reflected, the more she understood why her video had touched a nerve. People weren't shocked that discrimination happened. They were shocked to see someone in her position endure it. If this could happen to Zendaya Gray, CEO and majority shareholder, what hope was there for the single mother trying to cash her paycheck, or the young man applying for his first loan? Zendaya knew she couldn't allow the story to fade into the next viral trend. Outrage was easy. Change was hard. But she was determined to use the moment to start pressing for that change. She began drafting her thoughts for an upcoming public statement. It wouldn't be about her personal humiliation. It would be about the hidden cost of racism in banking. About how many families had been denied homes, businesses, and futures because someone behind a desk decided they didn't look trustworthy. She wrote one line and underlined it twice. Dignity should never be dependent on skin color, and access should never be determined by bias. The more she wrote, the clearer her mission became. Her confrontation at the branch wasn't the climax of her story. It was the catalyst. A turning point not just for her, but for everyone who had been forced to swallow their pride at a counter where they were treated as less. For Zendaya, the fight was no longer about one bank or one manager. It was about tearing down the unspoken rules that had suffocated generations. And she was ready to make that fight public. Zendaya had never sought the spotlight, but the spotlight had found her. News anchors dissected her every move, analysts debated whether her firings were justified, and opinion writers tried to frame her as either hero or opportunist. Through it all, Zendaya stayed silent until she was ready to speak. When she finally did, it wasn't at a press conference staged for cameras. It was at a community town hall, standing before an audience of everyday people. Teachers, small business owners, students, many of whom had felt the sting of discrimination themselves. Her words were direct. What happened to me at that branch is not unique. The only difference is that I had power to push back. Too many walk into banks, apply for loans, or simply try to cash a check and leave humiliated. They're told the numbers don't add up, or that policy doesn't allow it. But what they're really told is, you don't belong here. The room erupted in applause. Not because her story was new, but because it was theirs. Zendaya didn't stop with speeches. Within weeks, she launched the Equity in Finance Initiative, a program funded through her company and personal fortune. Its mission was bold: provide mentorship, seed funding, and low-interest loans to minority entrepreneurs who had been shut out of traditional banking. She partnered with churches, community centers, and grassroots leaders, creating a network of support that bypassed the very gatekeepers who had once barred her. Applications poured in: a young Black woman seeking capital for a bakery, a Latino father hoping to expand his landscaping business, an immigrant couple dreaming of opening a daycare. Each story carried echoes of Zendaya's own journey. At the same time, Zendaya used her position as majority shareholder to demand sweeping changes inside the bank itself. She called for mandatory anti-bias training, new oversight committees, and transparent reviews of lending practices. Resistance came quickly from executives who feared disruption, but Zendaya's influence was undeniable. "This is not about image," she told them in a closed-door meeting. "This is about survival. The public is watching, and so am I." Her advocacy reached beyond corporate walls. She wrote op-eds for major newspapers, appeared on national broadcasts, and testified before lawmakers about discriminatory practices in finance. Every platform became an opportunity to press one unshakable truth. Racism didn't vanish when people achieved success. It followed them into every space, from neighborhoods to banks to boardrooms. Her calm persistence began to inspire others. Employees from across industries wrote to her, saying they had challenged biased policies in their own workplaces because of her example. Parents shared how they used her story to teach their children resilience. College students quoted her speeches in their assignments, calling her a voice for dignity. But Zendaya remained grounded. She still drove her modest car, still carried her worn leather briefcase, still walked into rooms with the same quiet authority. Her message wasn't about glamour. It was about grit, endurance, and truth. She also understood that not everyone celebrated her. Critics claimed she had embarrassed the bank for personal gain, that she enjoyed firing people in public. Zendaya answered them with one line: "If losing a job for racism feels harsh, imagine losing dignity for it every day of your life." The backlash only fueled her determination. She knew that dismantling systemic bias wasn't a one-day event. It was a long battle, and she was prepared to fight it. Months after the confrontation, Zendaya stood once more in front of a crowd, this time at a university commencement ceremony. She looked out at rows of young graduates, many of them first-generation students, many of them carrying the same doubts she once carried. "They will question you," she told them. "They will doubt your worth, your belonging, your right to succeed. But remember this: silence is not surrender. Use your silence to gather strength, and when you speak, make sure the world cannot look away." The applause rose to a thunderous wave. Zendaya smiled softly, knowing that the incident in that bank had become more than a viral story. It had become a movement, an echo of hope ringing far beyond the walls where she had once stood accused. In the weeks following her town hall speech and the launch of the Equity in Finance Initiative, Zendaya began receiving more messages than she could possibly read in one sitting. Some arrived as handwritten letters, others as long emails or short notes on social media. They came from every corner of the country, each one carrying a story, a confession, or a thank you. One letter was from a grandmother in Alabama. "I was turned away from opening an account years ago because they said I didn't have the right documentation. I knew what they meant. I was too ashamed to go back. Watching you stand your ground reminded me of that day, but it also gave me peace. I wasn't imagining it. It was real, and it was wrong." Another came from a college student in Chicago. They denied me a student loan, even though my white classmate with the same grades and income was approved. I thought maybe I was overreacting, but your story proved what I felt. I'm not crazy, I'm not weak. I'm just fighting against something bigger than me. And then there was a note from a black father in New York. My teenage daughter saw your video. She asked me why people assumed you didn't belong there. I didn't know how to explain racism in words she'd understand. But I showed her how you stood tall, how you never let them see you shake. She told me, "Daddy, I want to be like her." Thank you for giving my daughter someone to look up to. These weren't isolated voices. They were echoes of the same truth reverberating everywhere. People had grown accustomed to swallowing humiliation in silence. Zendaya's public defiance had cracked that silence wide open. News programs began airing panels with ordinary citizens telling similar stories. Business magazines wrote about how discrimination cost banks billions in lost trust and missed opportunities. Activists hailed Zendaya as a catalyst for broader reform. But beyond the headlines and statistics were the raw, personal emotions. People saw themselves in Zendaya's calm gaze, in her refusal to back down. They recognized the countless times they had stayed quiet at a counter, in an office, on a sidewalk, because speaking up felt too dangerous. Zendaya's confrontation made one truth impossible to ignore. Racism didn't only exist in heated slurs or overt violence. It lived in everyday transactions, in the hesitation of a teller, in the narrowed eyes of a manager, in the quiet humiliation of being told no when the paperwork said yes. As her story spread, people began asking themselves harder questions. What would I have done if I had been in line at that bank? Would I have spoken up, or would I have stayed quiet? How many times have I assumed guilt instead of innocence because of the way someone looked? And for the viewers watching now, the questions echo the same way. Have you ever been denied something that was rightfully yours? Have you ever watched injustice unfold and struggled with whether to intervene? What would you have done if you were standing beside Zendaya in that lobby? The answers weren't easy, but the questions themselves mattered, because each one forced reflection, and reflection was the first step toward change. Zendaya herself often said, "It was never just about me. It was about making sure the next black woman who walks into a bank doesn't carry the weight of suspicion before she even speaks." The impact of her words reached classrooms, workplaces, and dinner tables. Teachers used her story as a discussion point about fairness. Employers began revisiting their hiring and promotion practices. Even some banking institutions, feeling the heat, started public reviews of their lending policies. The ripples were undeniable. Zendaya had not just exposed injustice. She had ignited a conversation that ordinary people carried into their own lives. But as powerful as the impact was, Zendaya knew it couldn't end with inspiration alone. Change needed to be permanent, woven into systems that had failed too many for too long. Her journey was not yet finished. The viral video, the speeches, the initiatives, these were sparks. What mattered next was keeping the fire alive. Months had passed since that day inside the bank, yet the memory of the manager's smirk, the whispers from the line, and the heavy steps of the guard still lingered in Zendaya's mind. Not as wounds, but as reminders. She often thought back to one simple truth. Money was never the real issue. That withdrawal slip could have been signed in seconds. The real issue was the doubt that followed her into the branch long before she spoke. The disbelief that someone who looked like her could rightfully hold so much power, so much wealth, so much ownership. It wasn't about the slip of paper. It was about dignity denied. And that was why she never regretted how she responded. By standing tall, she had forced an entire system to look at itself in the mirror. By refusing to be humiliated, she had given countless others permission to hold their heads high the next time they were told they didn't belong. She knew some people would always frame her as harsh, too direct, too uncompromising. But Zendaya never carried shame for demanding respect. She carried only pride, for her employees who received their paychecks on time, for the small businesses she had supported through her new initiative, and for the children who now saw her not just as a CEO, but as proof that silence could be turned into strength. In private moments, Zendaya reflected on the irony. The same bank that once doubted her now displayed her portrait in the lobby, honoring her role as a major shareholder. customers passed by daily, reminded that the very woman they once treated as a suspect was, in fact, the one keeping the doors open. To Zendaya, that picture wasn't about ego. It was about memory, a reminder that progress was built on moments of resistance, that dignity was preserved when people refused to bend under the weight of prejudice. And as her story continued to be told, Zendaya made sure it was never reduced to entertainment. It was a call to action. Because discrimination in banking wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern. A quiet, corrosive force that stole opportunities, limited futures, and robbed people of self-worth. Zendaya had lived through it, fought against it, and exposed it, but she wanted the world to remember. Her story was just one among thousands. Now, the question wasn't whether change was needed. The question was whether enough people were willing to demand it. Her final words on the matter were simple, yet unshakable. They thought denying me a withdrawal would strip me of my dignity. Instead, it proved that dignity can't be taken, it can only be surrendered, and I will never surrender mine. The weight of her voice lingered, not just in the halls of that bank, but in the hearts of those who heard it. And now, it lingers with you. Tell me, have you ever faced discrimination when you were only asking for what was rightfully yours? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear from every corner of the world. And as you do, let me know the country you're watching from. I love seeing this community of voices come together. If you believe no one should be denied dignity because of the color of their skin, then make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Each story we share keeps this conversation alive, pushing us closer to a world where respect is not negotiable, but guaranteed. Because money can be counted, but dignity must always be defended.